With me today are two of my esteemed colleagues, Becca Sturbins and Ashley Mancini. And as we go through this, Becca and Ashley and I are going to sort of speak to, really three core things having to do with how U.S. utilities in general are using social media, how it ultimately can be a brand enhancer. Ashley's going to talk a lot about social media and public policy. And then Becca's going to finish by sort of tying it together with sort of a look at how social media is connected to today's news industry. So I'll give just a brief overview of the project, and I'll say at the outset, there is a much more comprehensive 50-page report for anybody that wants a little good reading that goes into a lot more detail than we're going to go into today. But as I mentioned, we sort of started with a question that we get from a lot of clients and a lot of partners that we work with, which is, what should we be doing? Should we have a Facebook page? What should we be doing to sort of combat the chatter that we're hearing about on these social media? But almost every one of those questions comes to us in the context of everybody's using it. Right, so just looking at this graph, you can see, yeah, no question, rapidly in just the last 10 years, there's been a huge acceleration in terms of adults in the United States that are using different media. If you look at that from more of a localized perspective, I'll say briefly that our research was, conducted in the Pacific Northwest exclusively. We polled populations of both Oregon and Washington State, did a series of focus groups. But this just gives you a quick snapshot of sort of, who is using social media in the Pacific Northwest. We're a little bit above average. I believe the U.S. average is around 74-75% of most adults that are using social media, so we're at 80%. But there's still, 19% that say they're not using it, and not sure who the 1% are that don't seem to know what social media is, but there's obviously a statistical anomaly out there somewhere. Let's just take a brief look at an interesting sub-data point here on the 80% of Northwesterners that are using social media. So we asked a question of everybody that we polled, if you're using social media, how often do you use it? Here's something that's sort of surprising. So yes, they're using it. But if you start to kind of poke a little bit at these numbers, which is why, again, that graph that I showed at the very beginning here oftentimes is not as reliable, there are a lot of folks that are saying, yes, they're on it, yes, they use it, but they're not using it regularly. Some even say, yes, I have an account, but I never really use it that much. This begins to sort of not so much erode the numbers, but it certainly begs some questions of, what the actual numbers are in terms of usage. If you break this down by a couple of the other demographic groups, you can see, no shock, the 18 to 34s, those millennials are still the largest population. But the other population groups, as far as the age brackets, are not too far behind. 82% of 35 to 54-year-olds. I should mention that the 55 plus, it may look like a smaller number in comparison to millennials, but the 55 plus demographic is still the fastest growing group in terms of age of social media adoption in the U.S. and the Pacific Northwest. And if you go down even further and start looking at this by gender, a couple graphs here that just kind of explain to you some of the difference. Women have a tendency to be heavier users of social media compared to men. In the Pacific Northwest, we see a little bit of a statistical outlier in the left of center folks versus Republicans and independents or non-affiliated voters. So that just kind of gives you a little bit of the snapshot from the quantitative perspective, but I want to bring us back to the real focus of our work, which is, so how influential is social media in shaping public discourse and really shaping public perception and opinions of a lot of the issues that the natural gas industry and others are obviously wrestling with. So there's a sort of framework that we used in the outline of our work, and we really started by asking ourselves some questions that we wanted to get some answers to. And I'm going to just have to move this around here a little bit, so forgive me as I toggle around. But the first is, how is social media changing the ways in which people consume news and gain insight into current events? Becca's going to talk a little bit more about that. What is the public's perception of social media's value in public discourse. You'll see in some of the data slides that we're going to present that we really wanted to understand not just people's use of it, but how do they perceive other people's use of it? How do they perceive the role of social media in shaping our political discussions, the sort of national conversation that we're having around really complex issues? Does what people post on social media actually shape their opinions about those issues? Whether it's climate policy or anything related to a gas utility, all the way to a lot of the issues that we're having, or a lot of the debates we're having around things like socioeconomic issues like minimum wage. And then lastly, is social media just an echo chamber where like-minded viewpoints are reinforcing other like-minded viewpoints? And a lot of you are probably familiar with the perception that we have, which is I, Zach, have a very specific network on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. They're going to share a lot of opinions. They're going to share a lot of viewpoints that are very similar to mine. So is what I'm actually seeing as far as the curated content simply talking to me and saying, I'm right. The way I look at climate policy or the way I look at social and economic issues is correct because my friends tell me it's correct. So very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about how this relates to folks on the line, to your companies, right? How does social media connect to your brand? There are obviously a lot of really excellent case studies out there. I'm not going to go into great detail about these, but there are utilities, electric utilities, gas utilities that are doing an excellent job of really using social media for some pretty specific purposes. Our sense that most of you probably do one form of social media for these purposes. One of the biggest ones is obviously customer engagement. I'm sure a lot of folks here are using it to sort of talk directly to customers about various things connected to service and public safety. Another big one is just corporate social responsibility. How are gas utilities sort of talking to constituents, talking to customers about things that the company's doing, whether it's volunteering or reaching out and giving back to the community in certain ways. Public safety is obviously a big one, and programs and pilots that you might be doing something where you want to test pilot a water heater program, and so you're using social media to sort of engage people to participate, but also encouraging them to kind of foster a conversation and provide real-time feedback. And then lastly, crisis communications. That's probably not going to come as a surprise to anyone. It's probably the trickiest one because when things happen in the utility world, social media can be a great way, and it can also be a challenging way to get your message out there and to do rapid response. But before I close out on this particular section, I think it's important for everyone to hear that in the research that we did, we wanted to sort of understand, right, if this is what U.S. utilities are using social media for, you have to recognize that there's a very high expectation that a lot of these folks have when it comes to authenticity. This is a question that we see a lot in many of the folks that we work with across the corporate world. You are starting the conversation with folks on social media with a bias that you're not going to be authentic, that what you're saying is not really reflective of your values and beliefs. And you can see here just from the data that across the board there's a little bit of skepticism, of a pretty strong somewhat that think that businesses and corporations in the Pacific Northwest are fairly authentic. But then you start to combine the not very, the not at all, the don't knows, and those numbers begin to add up. So, where and when you're doing outreach and engagement through some of these platforms, it's really important to recognize your customer engagement, your crisis communications, rapid response, however you're using it. Authenticity is a really big component of that. And I'll just close that out by saying, we did a series of focus groups across the region in addition to the polling data that we're going to share. And the issue of authenticity continuously came up. In fact, we even did a focus group up in Seattle in which we had a utility behind the wall with us kind of watching this. And we had our moderator ask some questions about how they felt that the utility industry in general was doing. one of the things that just kind of rose to the top was, this statement about sort of how people view what social media really is. This particular gentleman said, look, I take the information that I see from a company with a grain of salt. It's a little bit like the writing on the bathroom wall. It's not really information, but it's not misinformation. It's opinions. And I think the biggest, part of this statement that really stuck out in my mind is that it's social before it's media, which is really important for us to remember. It's social before it's media, meaning as far as your brand is concerned, as far as customer engagement, customer outreach, recognize that most people are using these platforms for social purposes. So the more you can sort of meet them at that intersection, as opposed to trying to convey, facts and figures about, climate issues or methane gas leakage, just recognize that's why most folks are at the table. All right, so I'm going to try to hand over controls to my colleague Ashley and mute myself, but Ashley's going to talk about this next section on public policy.
Great, thanks, Zach. And just a reminder to everyone, we don't want to talk at you for the whole hour, so please feel free to submit questions in that chat box as they come up. We're happy to address those. So yeah, as Zach mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the intersection of social media and public policy. And one of the things that we really focused on throughout this whole process was kind of answering the why question. A lot of, as Zach mentioned, a lot of studies are out there on usage, but we really wanted to kind of get at that value question. Why are people using it? Do they believe it makes a difference? And so I hope to answer some of those questions throughout this section. So kind of rolling backwards here, we're in 2016 now, but taking you back a couple of years to 2011. So this is the Fukushima plant in Japan. I'm sure many of you are aware of and very familiar with the whole situation. The reason that I'm bringing this up is because it was 5 years ago, which was somewhat early in the use of social media for public policy. Zach mentioned that people are really using social media to be social, but there are also examples of times when they're looking at it for information and for a resource. And so, on the next slide, these are just two examples of kinds of, nightmare scenarios for the industry, things that they don't want to see. But what this kind of made them realize was, hey, this crisis happened across the ocean, over in Japan. But what will that do to us as an industry? How will that impact our public perception? And they said we need to do something proactive, because they looked at the people that will be making those decisions. And looking around at regulators, at elected officials, a lot of times these aren't people who are experts in every industry. It's really hard to be an expert at everything. And so the industry decided, okay, we need to speak with one voice. We need to get out there in front of this so that this doesn't come back to bite us from a legislative or a regulatory perspective. And we need to be talking where the people are. And Zach kind of showed us that. He walked through those numbers. People are on social media. So it's not enough anymore to take out an ad in the Seattle Times or to just do some direct lobbying. You really have to make sure that you kind of get through that clutter, and that's what NEI did. And they ended up winning some communicator awards for their effort. They were on podcasts, YouTube, Twitter, so really trying to get out there because they had this belief that social media did make an impact. And what I'm going to kind of walk through here in a second is some of the data that backs up that belief. And so on the next slide, you'll see one of the reasons why a lot of organizations find it necessary to be on social media. Advocacy organizations, NGOs, nonprofits are not constrained in the same way that a lot of businesses are. And they really have an opportunity, and they've really taken that opportunity to get on social media, to be extremely proactive, to really grab the reins. And so they're having this conversation. They're talking about public policy that's important to them. And industry said, okay, we need to be there too. We can't just completely abdicate this conversation and let them drive everything. So why are they doing that? Is there a reason? And on the next slide, you'll see one of the data points that we asked, has social media ever changed your opinion on a political issue? And this is, again, here in the Pacific Northwest. 62% say no. My opinion on gun control hasn't been changed because of social media. But 26% of those say yes. And I think, that's a big chunk. I think that this is a little bit higher than I would have necessarily just kind of guessed without having the actual data. Changing your opinion is a pretty strong stance. So who are those people that have changed their opinion? What does this mean? It is millennials, it's women, and it's Democrats. And we'll see that same pattern again here in a minute on another question that we asked. But it is really important just to keep those audiences in mind as you're kind of creating content, thinking about, okay, who are actually those people who are swayable, when I'm creating my content. So on the next slide, we asked, how much influence does what people say or post on social media have on your support for public policy? So not necessarily did you change your mind, but do you think that you are, more supportive of an issue because of something that you've seen? 58% said a lot or some. And this is interesting. I mean, it's the exact kind of opposite numbers that we saw on here. So, you may not be able to get somebody to completely change their opinion, change their mind, but, they could be moved a little bit. They can see something on social media that's from a friend, from a colleague, from a trusted, someone that they trust, and that could sway them a bit. So what does that mean here on the next slide? What does that mean for political leaders? We're seeing those first three data points that I just showed you were really focused on what people believe about themselves and their peers. But what do they believe about elected officials? How much influence does social media activity have on directing political leaders in the Pacific Northwest to support or oppose public policy? And this is a big number. 59% say a lot or some. So here again, we're seeing that people believe that their elected officials are listening to them. So that gets us back to the NEI example that I kind of walked through briefly earlier. Everybody kind of believes, 60% of people kind of believe that elected officials are looking at social media and using it to kind of frame their decision-making around public policy issues. So here on the next slide, we see that from the actual elected officials. So this is at the federal level. The Congressional Management Foundation has done some pretty extensive studies on the way that elected officials use social media and the value that they see. And what we found is that for them, they believe that it only takes 3 or fewer comments for their office to pay attention. So now we're seeing it kind of, the belief that the public has that elected officials are listening is actually borne out in this data point. They are listening, and so it's important to be part of that conversation. So this gets to the question that Zach was kind of talking about earlier. Are you just surrounding yourself with friends that have the same viewpoints that you do? 51% of people that responded here in the Pacific Northwest said that social media only validates people's existing views on the issue. Here again, though, we're seeing 1/3 of people believe that it helps educate and challenge people's views. So that's 1/3 of your customers, of your ratepayers saying, I could be educated by things that I'm seeing on social media. A brand, a company could get out there, they could say something, and it could change my opinion. And that's a pretty big swath of the public there. So again, who are these people? Again, they're the same group. A little higher numbers here, but again, millennials, women, and Democrats. So important to think of your audience as you're kind of coming up with that strategy for engagement. And then on the next slide, we'll just turn things over to Becca. I think that the last thing I wanted to kind of leave you with here is that although the numbers they're not overwhelming as far as, 100% of people are going to use social media to get all of their policy issues. Elected officials are listening, and people believe that there is value, and they believe that there are things that they could hear on social media that could change their mind. And I think one of the big reasons for that is kind of what we'll see here in the next section on journalism and on the way that people are consuming their news. So I will go ahead and turn things over to Becca to kind of talk through that.
Great, thanks, Ashley. So this is the section about social media and the news. So just taking a quick look at what people say is the primary reason that they actually use social media. And you'll see that getting news comes in a very far second at just 8%. But as we start to dig a bit deeper, I think that we'll see that even though that's not necessarily why people are there, it definitely is something that people are taking in. So you'll see here, so this is, as Ashley and Zach were previously saying, specifically focused on the more metropolitan areas of Oregon and Washington. It's pretty split. About half of the folks that we surveyed said that they did get news about what's going on in their community on social media. Similarly, it's about split here too. So 51% of people said they spent the same or more time on social media compared to other news sources. And I think that also just kind of validates the fact that, a lot of people do see social media as a place to get their news. This is something that we thought would be pretty important to dig into, which is how do people see the interaction between traditional news, whether it's the newspaper, if it's their, local TV news, which now has segments, showing what's, trending on Twitter, and they have their panda videos on your local news probably, as well as they have here in Portland. But 16% of folks that we surveyed said that they thought that social media had little to no influence on the news. 30% thought that it was making journalism better, that it was making journalism more responsive to issues, that they were, being able to respond faster. But 40% of folks said that they thought that journalism was actually getting a little bit worse. And, when we had our focus groups, one thing that we heard was that it's made the desire to be first versus the desire to be right, or having the complete story kind of leading there. And I think for folks working in an industry, whether it's related to crisis communications or campaign planning, being part of that social media cycle is really important to make sure that your information is included in that first story. All right, so this is something that I couldn't not include. This is just a great example. We received a question earlier through the chat function asking about, is this just, clickbait and folks responding or sharing information, or are people actually digging in? This is, for folks who are not familiar, the 2014 NPR April Fool jokes, What Has Become of Our Brains, where they posted this link, Why Doesn't America Read Anymore? And if you clicked on the link, you would be taken to a page on the NPR website that said, congratulations, you're one of the few Americans that actually reads. If you did not click on the link and you responded, which hundreds of people did, you would be proving their point, which is, a lot of people are just responding. They just have raw emotions, and they're just throwing things out on social media. So we were not able to, really dig in and decipher, person by person, survey by survey, what people were actually consuming, if they thought that they were, reading thoroughly through all of the policy information, or just getting the news. So I just wanted to throw that out there. This is something that I think is pretty important, just with some of the current events and whether it is a political coup or, Black Lives Matter, or if it is, something going on with water in different parts of the country. Does social media have greater, the same, or less impact on bringing about change than traditional journalism? And going back to what Ashley was saying earlier about who's listening on social, where are people getting their information, and a good majority of folks, so 55% of the folks that we surveyed, thought that social media did as much or more than traditional journalism to really bring attention to issues that are taking place in their community.
So I'll just finish out with a little bit of an outlier section, but I think if we all pause and sort of acknowledge what's happening right now in Flint, Michigan, that this particular topic that we explored in our analysis and research will begin to make sense. And that has to do with, not just, the different demographic groups that are using social media, but looking at the differences across different ethnicities in terms of why they're using it, the value that they place on it, the role that it plays in disseminating information about issues that really pertain to them. So just recognize, and of course this is obviously this is a public sector water utility in Flint, Michigan, not the same as a natural gas company, but recognize the same sort of public health challenge, crisis, can certainly inflict utility across the spectrum. One of the things that is probably worth recognizing, and this is not just from our research, our literature. There was a very well done national survey that was conducted by the National Journal just a few months ago that really highlighted the role that race plays in information that different communities are sharing on social media. If you ask a white social media user what it is that they're posting, what content are they sharing, what information are they consuming on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, across the board, the majority are saying it's entertainment. If you compare that to African American Hispanic users, you'll see predominantly those racial groups are talking about issues related to public safety, education. These are really issue-driven, local, community-based issues that they're using these media to talk about. And I think it's important to just sort of recognize that, because as you're thinking about customers in diverse service territories, you have to recognize that just like in Flint, very quickly you can find yourself in a situation where you're having to use different channels to engage lots of different communities. It's not homogenous. Going back to one of the data points we mentioned earlier, so we asked the question in our survey, is social media really where people are getting news about what's going on in the community? And you see there's almost a 50-50 split here, a little bit more on the disagree side. But when you put that in the context of race, you'll see that there's a difference. And I recognize the color bars here are a little misleading, but this is the agree group. So 41% of whites are saying they agree, but compared to a real statistical difference with non-white populations. This is obviously an area where we would certainly say our research is not the end-all research in terms of exploring this particular issue, but it actually mirrored a lot of the data that we saw in the National Journal study that was done around the same time. And then lastly, on this issue of race and diversity, Becca mentioned Black Lives Matter. That is certainly probably the foremost case study right now nationally in terms of how social media is being used by different racial groups and the role that it plays and the value that it brings. But we couldn't ignore a particular data point, which it has to do with censorship. I will speak for myself in saying I know I tone down my opinions on social media. I think, in a broader context, is what I'm about to say really going to change someone's opinion? Is it really going to influence them? Is it going to, make me look bad? Are my colleagues going to, misunderstand or misinterpret my intentions? And what we thought was interesting is that there's a tendency amongst white populations to censor their personal opinions on social media compared to other racial groups, right? And that's in large part because there is this sort of national trend that we're beginning to see, that minority populations are saying this is the only place where we can raise awareness about the issues that matter to us. So just keeping in mind that that's an important, that'll be an important factor as you're talking about different socioeconomic and racial groups in your service territories. So some final thoughts, and I think what we are going to try to do is start, taking questions. So if there are questions that are going to begin to roll in, feel free to start typing them out. There's a really well-respected researcher at the Pew Center in DC named Amy Mitchell, who we talked to as part of our work. And she said something that I thought was particularly important for everyone to just take away from this. This webinar here on a given day is not the end-all be-all of sort of what's happening with social media. And Amy sort of reminded me that we are only beginning to understand the complexities of how things like individual choices as far as the content and the people that we're networking with, algorithms that these social media companies are using to sort of put certain information and certain content in front of you. All of this stuff is really complex, and we in communications world have a tendency to want to say, well, what's the silver bullet? Tell me what I should be doing. So if there's one message that Becca and Ashley and I can leave you with here, it's you have to continue to study and analyze this. You have to think critically about who your audience is. If you're a utility that's dealing with a situation that affects a specific community, your approach, response, your strategy, your message is going to be very different in terms of what you're communicating and what you're saying. But recognize and give yourselves permission to say it's complicated, right? There are no silver bullets. There are no easy answers when it comes to exactly what's happening in this space. So that in 40 minutes is a lot of information that's culled out of a much more comprehensive report. We encourage folks that might be interested to go online, take a look at it. There's a lot more data than we've had time to go over here today. And I think what we'll do is try to open it up, and I know we've got some questions coming in. And
yeah, we do want to encourage you to use the chat function to ask your questions, or you can reply to the email we sent out giving you the GoToMeeting link, and we'll respond as best we're able. We do have a question here. Isn't information about one's community different than news, per se?
It's a good question, and it's a complicated one. It's a big question that probably I'm not going to be able to answer easily here. I will say that some of the other interesting facets of the issues around how different communities are using social media and viewing social media compared to traditional outlets has more to do with how mainstream media, the Fourth Estate in general, may or may not be covering certain issues. The issues in Flint, largely can be said to be sort of focused around, this event took place, lead was, put into the pipes this way, this is what happened. And you're seeing this more with Black Lives Matter and other areas where these are issues that oftentimes aren't covered until other channels, right, non-traditional media channels are addressing the issue. We're certainly seeing that with what's happening with, just racial violence in the United States in general. It's a good question, right? So what is a news outlet if it's coming through social? Is it just a person's opinion? Really complex, hard to say. But different social and ethnic groups are using social media as a way of raising awareness of issues that aren't really being covered in the mainstream.
We have another question. Have you looked at the role of a company's employees in supporting, extending, or undermining company messages via social media?
Becca's shaking her head no. So have you looked at the role of a company's employees in supporting, extending, or undermining company message via social media? I will be honest in saying no, that is not a topic that we directly explored. one of the things that you saw earlier had to do with censorship. And we did ask a couple of questions related to how authentic people that were using social media felt that their employers were. And that those authenticity scores kind of mirrored the broad authenticity scores we saw for corporations and businesses generally. So not super authentic, but authentic enough that I'm willing to sort of give people the benefit of the doubt. I think the question that's being asked with how does an employee extend the value of that gets into areas around, does the company that you're working for have a social media policy? Do employees feel empowered to share, promote, discuss, wade into complex issues that might be happening affecting the business? And that's going to be different for every company and every institution. But that's how I guess we could best answer the question around employee engagement in terms of extending and supporting the messages that might be out there on social.
So a follow-up question then is, in your crosstabs, did you happen to discover, say, what percentage of people use social media for work?
No, we did not. We did not specifically ask what function people were using it for. One of the only questions we asked that maybe gets close to that was one of the data points that Becca showed, which is that most people say overwhelmingly it's predominantly being used for social and personal purposes, not work-related.
So it goes back to one of your opening comments or quotes that you cited, which is social media is first social and then media.
Yep.
Perhaps. We do have another question here. What, if any, advice would you have on effective use of social media for companies that offer largely proprietary services for clients?
So I guess I would want to define proprietary services.
Subscription in this case. This is subscription service, a newsletter, regional in scope, generally speaking, energy, trade publication.
I would probably say that gets back to some of the basics, which has to do with identifying who your customers are that are buying, purchasing, acquiring that proprietary service, and having a clear understanding of where the value is for them. Anytime you're doing something that's sort of transactional, sales-oriented, services-oriented, it's going to get back to the first thing I mentioned at the very beginning, which is customer engagement. How are you sort of using those channels to engage the customer? There are certainly businesses out there that do phenomenal jobs of really just using Twitter, Facebook, other channels to hyper-focus on customer service. How can we deliver the best service? How can we fix problems when they come up? How can we address issues that relate to everything from packaging and delivery? I'm not sure if there's a specific proprietary service that you might be thinking of, but that is one of the, I think, most important things that any business can do, which is sort of start it not as a way to just start talking about your company and promoting stuff. How can you use it as a way to deliver exceptional service to your customers?
Thank you, Zach. I have a follow-up question while we're waiting for any others that may come in, or maybe not a follow-up question. When we first looked at engaging in social media at the Gas Association, this was 7 years ago or so, and we first started talking about it. First, our staff person who was responsible for doing this had to convince me, an old guy, that this was a place where we needed to be. And, of course, we talked to our board about it, and they started from the position, our board, the six gas utilities and 3 pipeline companies. Most of them had policies in place that said absolutely no social media use by employees. That's changed quite a lot, and in fact, I think we're seeing our member companies use it in particular effectively for not really crisis management, but certainly event, storm recovery, and kind of informing their customers about progress on on recovery and the like. But I was told by one consultant basically that, look, that the value of being in social media is you're not necessarily going to use it as a place to push information, but you want conversations are happening about your industry in this space, and you want to be present where those conversations are occurring so that you can respond when the situation calls for it. So I guess my question is, that was 7 years ago. Is that still valid advice or counsel for folks today? Not necessarily as a channel to push information, but more as an area to engage when conversations are occurring about things that are relevant to you.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it gets to the double-edged sword that I think we all wrestle with in communications when it comes to a lot of these channels, which is they're rapid fire, they're immediate, information goes out very quickly, and so in some respects we almost train ourselves to think that the rapidity therefore means that the faster I respond, the faster I'm going to sway people, the faster things will change. And something that we saw and we heard in we did a series of focus groups in different markets around our polling area, and one of the key things that we heard was that social media actually has most value over long periods of time. And when it comes to public policy in particular, when it comes to political issues, people say, look, 10 years ago, I didn't think about social or political issue X this way, but actually through the course of seeing different viewpoints, of maybe not so much engaging in a debate on Facebook, but observing how other people see an issue that I felt passionately about, my viewpoint, my attitude, my belief on that particular issue has evolved. And we certainly have seen it on issues related to gay marriage. We've seen it on issues related to climate change. We've seen it on issues related to everything from minimum wage to public safety and issues having to do with race relations in the U.S. So give yourselves permission, I think, to say this is a long haul. Like it's not going to be the same. To Dan's point, it's not going to be as immediate as a press release. It's not going to be as fast as the sort of general public relations. If it's done well, it happens over many years, and it is part of a dialogue. It really is. That's where the social part of social media, I think, really comes into play. To add something.
And Dan, this is Ashley. You had said something, I think, that really got to...
Ashley, do you want to chime in?
Oh, are you able to hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now, Ash.
Okay, great. Thanks, Zach. So Dan, you had mentioned something, while you were asking your question about the value of being present while these conversations are happening, because you're absolutely right, they are happening about your company. So you want to make sure that you're present. But that, to a certain extent, can be, passive, a way to monitor. But there is also value in being proactive. And what Zach was saying, with building up these conversations over a period of time, you'll build up your trust and your credibility to be a resource. And I think that, your question gets at the idea of putting information out. Somebody saying 7 or 8 years ago, should we put out information? The value of Twitter now, and I say this in particular to Twitter, is that it's really becoming a place where people are looking for information. So you can become that kind of trusted source. And so done well over time, like Zach said, building up your reputation, being proactive and using it to push out information is very, very valuable. Journalists and reporters are on social media and are in many cases have the expectation from their newsroom that they will be tweeting, you know, X number of times per day. So if you can be present when those conversations are being had, and then also pushing out your information, I think that's really important too.
So there's an additional question that just came in having to do with the status of Twitter, and in terms of you know, its adoption and its use, and sort of asking for our perspective on that. I don't have the latest numbers, but I know there's a couple of sources of information that I can cite here. You know, first and foremost, one of the challenges is a lot of these social media companies now are publicly traded. Twitter's stock price has not done particularly well. No stock price has done particularly well in 2016, but there's been a lot of change. There's been a lot of pressure on these companies, Twitter included, to make money and to, you know, accelerate growth and adoption and revenue. So some people have sort of speculated, does this mean that, you know, Twitter is eroding as a tool? Something that is probably worth pointing out that maybe negates that is where Twitter is accelerating the most is amongst young people, particularly folks under the age of 20. We saw this in our polling. In fact, if you go through and actually read the report, we break down some of the different social and demographic groups. Young people are actually abandoning Twitter very quickly because old people are taking it up, or excuse me, Facebook. Thank you. Young people are jumping off of Facebook as older populations take it up, and the place that they're going, one of the primary landing points is Twitter. So you are just looking at a much longer tail in terms of the adoption curve that I think we might expect to see. But here's another way of sort of maybe looking at it. It's not so much, you know, what platform has the most users or is accelerating users at the fastest rate. It's a recognition that there's a platform that has not yet been created. There's a platform that has not yet been adopted or is really not out there in sort of the common lexicon yet that we'll be talking about inside of 3 years. So this changes rapidly. I think we're going to continue to see different tools and technologies come online. So it's more about, and I think what our report really tries to get you is more about the sort of psychology of what's happening in communications than it is worrying about the adoption rates of any one platform.
We have a related question, Zach, actually really related to your answer. Would you agree that in general, huge generalization, Twitter is used by users more for information and Facebook more for entertainment or social interaction?
I will speak for myself, and Becca maybe will disagree or chime in with a different thought. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the primary functions of a platform like Twitter is, you know, it's sort of like the ticker at the bottom of the screen on cable news. It's a lot of information fairly quickly. I can scan things at a pretty good clip. And I can click on things, as Becca's NPR example happened. When I actually want to read something, I can go in and dive a little deeper. And that's also probably as a function of, you know, as a PR consultant, one of the things we're always mindful of is it is a really, really commonly used tool now in newsrooms. Reporters, you know, AP, Oregonian, Seattle Times, doesn't matter what newsroom you're in. They are using that to mine for information coming out of a Northwest Gas Association, but they're also using it to mine for information coming directly from consumers. So, you know, if it's a power outage, if it's a gas leak, if it's you know, an environmental, you know, issue that's affecting a certain area, the media are using Twitter very heavily. Yeah, and I will say, you know, personally, Facebook is where I post pictures of my kids. I mean, that's me. I don't know if you have a different thought.
Yeah, I would just say to the individual asking the question, yes. You know, Twitter is especially helpful if you are trying to actually get information to news reporters or, you know, monitor public hearings, that kind of thing.
Okay, any closing comments or concluding, wrap it up with a bow for us, Zach?
I hope that everyone sort of, gains something from the last hour. We're trying to sort of breeze over a lot of really complex topics and questions. Encourage folks that are interested to sort of dive a little bit more into this in the report, and recognize that the last hour really is just sort of a teaser of the issues and trends that we have observed during a very specific snapshot in time. I think as far as the members of this particular association goes, hopefully it's useful because, we are starting legislative sessions in the Pacific Northwest. There are a lot of challenges, environmental challenges, climate policy challenges, and hopefully some of this really sort of makes some connections to be thinking about in terms of how what's happening online, what's happening on social media, may or may not be driving sort of the agenda, but also the discussion that folks are having about those issues.